On the night of August 15, 1971, the entire global financial system, one built over centuries, quietly died. Not with a crash, not with a crisis, but with a calm, rehearsed speech from a wooden desk in the White House. As Americans ate dinner and watched their televisions flicker, President Richard Nixon made an announcement that was never supposed to happen. The United States would no longer honor the dollar's promise to turn paper money into gold. In that single instant, the world discovered the truth. The US dollar, foundation of global trade, trust, and wealth, was no longer money. It was something new, something without limits, something no nation had ever used before. And almost no one understood what had just happened. Foreign governments panicked, economists scrambled, and a hidden chain reaction began, one that would unleash inflation, debt, financial instability, wealth inequality, and a new world order built not on gold, but on faith. Act 1. The old world of money, the gold standard mindset. There was a time when money meant something you could hold, something real, something that gleamed under electric light and carried the weight of centuries in your palm. Gold. For thousands of years, civilizations rose and fell, empires conquered and crumbled, but one truth remained constant. Gold was wealth. Gold was trust. Gold was the universal language spoken between nations that otherwise despised each other. When a king held gold, he held power. When a nation accumulated gold reserves, it accumulated stability. The metal itself was neutral, indifferent to politics, immune to speeches and promises. It simply was, a physical certainty in an uncertain world. And so, nations hoarded it. They built vaults deep underground, filled them with bars stamped with national seals, and counted their reserves like a dragon counts treasure. Because in the logic of the gold standard, money was not an idea. Money was a thing. And that thing could not be printed, wished into existence, or multiplied by decree. This was the foundation upon which the modern world built itself. Post-Washington, Bretton Woods system. In July 1944, as World War II still raged across Europe and the Pacific, 730 delegates from 44 nations gathered at the Mount Washington Hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. Their mission was ambitious, perhaps impossible, to redesign the architecture of global finance, to create a system that would prevent the economic chaos that had birthed fascism and plunged the world into war. What emerged from those summer meetings was elegant in its simplicity and revolutionary in its implications. The United States, which held nearly two-thirds of the world's monetary gold, would become the anchor of the global system. The dollar would be pegged to gold at a fixed rate of $35 per ounce, and every other currency would be pegged to the dollar. This created a pyramid of trust. At the base, gold. On the next level, the American dollar. And, spreading outward from there, pounds, francs, marks, yen, all tied to the dollar, all indirectly backed by the gold sitting in the basement of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York and in the fortress of Fort Knox. The dollar became, in effect, the world's gold proxy. A piece of paper that promised, guaranteed, swore on the honor of the United States government that it could be exchanged for gold at any time. No questions asked. This was America's promise to the world. This was the deal that rebuilt international commerce after the ashes of war. This was the system that would create the greatest economic expansion in human history. America's promise. Picture the scene. A foreign central banker, perhaps from France or Germany or Japan, standing in the vault of the New York Federal Reserve. Around him, stacked floor to ceiling, are the gold reserves of nations. Each country's holdings separated by wire cages, each bar marked with weight and purity, each ounce representing the wealth and labor of millions of citizens. The banker holds a stack of US dollars, green paper adorned with the faces of dead presidents. He presents these dollars to an American official, and in return, without hesitation, without question, the American officials transfer gold bars from the United States cage to his nation's cage. $35 equals 1 ounce of gold. The math is simple. The promise is absolute. This is what made the Bretton Woods system work. Not complex economic theory, not international law, but a simple physical guarantee that anyone holding dollars could exchange them for something real. Foreign nations accumulated dollars through trade, through loans, through American military spending abroad, and they trusted these dollars because they absolutely knew, that the United States had the gold to back them up. The system was stable, the system was logical, the system created prosperity, until it didn't. The quiet cracks. The cracks appeared slowly at first, hairline fractures in what seemed to be an impenetrable foundation. It began with choices, with pressures, with the weight of empire. In 1965, President Lyndon Johnson escalated American involvement in Vietnam, sending hundreds of thousands of troops into the jungles of Southeast Asia. The war was expensive, staggeringly, catastrophically expensive. Billions of dollars flowed out of the Treasury every month, paying for weapons, paying for soldiers, paying for a conflict that seemed to have no end. Simultaneously, Johnson launched the Great Society, an ambitious suite of domestic programs designed to eliminate poverty and racial injustice. Medicare, Medicaid, education funding, urban development. Noble goals, enormous costs. And the United States, confident in its power and prosperity, decided to pay for both. Guns and butter, war abroad and utopia at home. An impossibility in the arithmetic of limited resources, but America tried nonetheless. To fund these parallel ambitions, the Federal Reserve did what central banks do when governments spend beyond their means. It printed money. Not literally printing, of course, that's too crude a description. The Fed expanded credit, purchased government bonds, increased the money supply. Dollars flowed into circulation, more and more of them, flooding into the American economy and then spilling out across the world through trade and military expenditure. And slowly, quietly, the ratio began to shift. More dollars, same amount of gold. Foreign central banks started noticing. Their analysts, hunched over ledgers in Basel and Paris and Tokyo, began tracking the numbers with growing concern. The United States had issued more dollars than it had gold to redeem them. The promise, the sacred guarantee at the heart of Bretton Woods, was becoming mathematically impossible to keep. AC2. The world begins doubting America. European analysts noticed the imbalance in the wood-paneled offices of European finance ministries. A quiet panic began to spread. It started with numbers, simple arithmetic that anyone with a calculator could verify. The analysts tracked two figures: the amount of dollars held by foreign central banks and the amount of gold held in American vaults. By the late 1960s, those numbers told a terrifying story. Foreign governments and central banks held approximately $60 billion. The United States held gold reserves worth, at the official rate of $35 per ounce, roughly $12 billion. Pause and absorb that disparity. $60 billion in claims, $12 billion in gold. If every foreign holder of dollars decided to redeem them simultaneously, a bank run on a global scale, the United States could cover only 20% of its obligations. In the conference rooms of Frankfurt and London, officials stared at these numbers with growing alarm. This wasn't speculation or conspiracy theory. This was public data, carefully compiled from official sources. The American emperor had no clothes, and anyone paying attention could see the nakedness. The shock rippled through the European financial establishment. Phone calls were made, secret meetings convened, and a question began to circulate in whispers. If the United States cannot honor its promise, what happens to the world? De Gaulle's warning. Charles de Gaulle, President of France, was not a man prone to whispers. In February 1965, at a press conference that would send shockwaves through international finance, de Gaulle announced that France would begin converting its dollar reserves into gold. Not some of them, all of them. His reasoning was cold, logical, unassailable. The gold standard, he argued, was the only impartial system, free from the national policies of any single country. The dollar's privileged position allowed the United States to finance its deficits, its wars, its spending, its ambitions, by simply printing more money, exporting inflation to the rest of the world. This, de Gaulle declared, was unacceptable. France would reclaim its gold. American officials were furious. They saw this as betrayal, as ingratitude from a nation America had helped liberate. But de Gaulle saw it differently. He saw mathematics, inevitability, the approaching collapse of an unsustainable system. And he acted. Central banks quietly redeemed gold. What France did openly, others did quietly. Throughout the late 1960s, an increasing number of nations began redeeming dollars for gold. Not dramatically, not with press conferences, but through discreet transactions, official channels, the quiet movement of wealth. Ships departed from New York Harbor, carrying crates filled with gold bars, bound for vaults in Europe and Asia. Armored trucks made regular trips to Fort Knox, loading American wealth onto aircraft destined for foreign capitals. The flow was steady, relentless, one direction only. U.S. gold reserves, which had peaked at 20,000 tons after World War II, dwindled to 8,000 tons by 1971. The national treasure, accumulated over decades, was hemorrhaging away at an accelerating pace. Inside the Federal Reserve and the Treasury Department, officials watched the numbers with mounting dread. They ran projections, calculated timelines, tried to determine how long the system could survive. The answer was always the same: not long enough. The mathematical certainty. By 1971, the arithmetic had become inescapable, brutal in its simplicity. Foreign central banks held dollars worth more than 4 times the U.S. gold reserves. If confidence collapsed, if panic set in and nations rushed to redeem their holdings, the United States would run out of gold in weeks, perhaps days. And then what? Default? Declare bankruptcy? Admit to the world that the promise at the heart of American power was a lie? The system wasn't just unsustainable. The system was already dead. It was a corpse propped up by nothing more than the collective will to pretend it was still alive. Every analyst understood this. Every informed official knew the truth. The question wasn't whether the Bretton Woods system would collapse. The question was when and who would pull the trigger. Act 3, the breaking point, the weekend crisis meetings, August 13th, 1971, a Friday afternoon. President Richard Nixon departed the White House via helicopter, bound for Camp David, the presidential retreat nestled in the mountains of Maryland. Officially, he was taking a weekend to relax, to escape the sweltering heat of Washington. The truth was far more urgent. Joining Nixon in the mountain compound was a small group of the most powerful economic officials in America: Treasury Secretary John Connally, Federal Reserve Chairman Arthur Burns, Budget Director George Shultz, and a handful of trusted advisors. They gathered in the rustic lodge, away from reporters, away from Congress, away from the possibility of leaks, and they confronted the question that had been approaching like a storm for years. What do we do about gold? The debates were intense, sometimes heated. Arthur Burns argued for preserving the gold standard, warning that abandoning it would unleash inflation and destroy the dollar's credibility. Others pushed for incremental measures, raising the gold price, imposing capital controls, negotiating with European allies. But Treasury Secretary Connally, a blunt-spoken former Texas governor, argued for the radical option: close the gold window entirely, end convertibility, force the world onto a new system whether they liked it or not. Nixon listened, calculated, weighed political consequences against economic necessity. An election loomed in 1972. The economy was suffering from both inflation and unemployment. A combination economists had said was impossible. Something dramatic was needed, something that would shift the narrative, that would make Nixon appear decisive and strong. By Sunday evening, the decision was made. The gold window would close, the promise would end, and the world would never be the same. Nixon's motives. Understanding. Nixon's decision requires understanding his moment. Inflation was rising, eating away at American purchasing power. The trade deficit, once unthinkable for the mighty United States, had reached record levels. Unemployment was climbing. The economy, despite unprecedented government spending, was sputtering. This shouldn't have been possible. In the Keynesian models that dominated economic thinking, inflation and unemployment moved in opposite directions. You could have one or the other, but not both simultaneously. Yet there it was. Stagflation, a word invented to describe an impossible reality. Nixon faced enormous political pressure. Labor unions demanded wage increases to match inflation. Business leaders complained about foreign competition. And everywhere, the growing sense that America was losing its edge, its dominance, its control. The gold standard in this context was a straitjacket. It limited how much the Federal Reserve could expand the money supply. It constrained government spending. It made the United States vulnerable to the whims of foreign central banks who could drain American gold reserves at will. To Nixon, the choice was clear. Keep the promise and watch the economy and his presidency collapse, or break the promise and seize control of America's monetary destiny. He chose power over principle, sovereignty over obligation, the future over the past. The decision. Sunday, August 15, 1971, late afternoon. In the lodge at Camp David, Nixon gave the final orders. Speechwriters were summoned. Television networks were contacted. Preparations were made for a prime-time address to the nation. The announcement would include three major elements. First, a 90-day freeze on wages and prices to combat inflation. Second, a 10% surcharge on imports to protect American industry. And third, buried somewhat in the middle of the speech, the bombshell, the United States would temporarily suspend the convertibility of dollars into gold. Temporarily. That word would prove to be a lie, though perhaps Nixon himself didn't know it yet. The suspension would never be lifted. The window, once closed, would remain shut forever. The speech. That evening, at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, millions of Americans turned on their television sets and saw their president, looking stern and resolute, addressing them from the Oval Office. Nixon's tone was calm, almost casual, as if he were discussing a minor policy adjustment rather than detonating the foundations of the global financial system. He spoke of protecting American workers, of defending the dollar against speculators, of ensuring prosperity and stability. He used language designed to sound protective, reassuring, strong. And then, with almost bureaucratic plainness, he delivered the sentence that changed everything. I have directed the Secretary of the Treasury to take the action necessary to defend the dollar against the speculators. I have directed Secretary Connolly to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold. Suspend temporarily. Defend. Protect. Words chosen carefully. Words meant to obscure the magnitude of what was happening. Most Americans eating dinner or preparing for bed barely noticed. It sounded technical, complicated, something only economists needed to worry about. But in capitals across Europe and Asia, where it was already Monday morning, officials woke to the news and understood immediately. The United States had just unilaterally torn up the agreement that structured global commerce. The anchor of the world economy had been cut loose, and no one, not even the Americans themselves, knew what would happen next. Act 4. The global panic. Foreign leaders. Furious. The British government learned of Nixon's decision through a phone call in the middle of the night. No consultation, no warning, just a courtesy notification minutes before the speech aired. The Bank of England convened an emergency meeting at dawn, officials arriving in darkness to confront a crisis none of them had anticipated. How do you value the pound when its foundation, the dollar-gold link, has just vanished? In Tokyo, the finance ministry scrambled to respond. Japan held enormous dollar reserves, accumulated through years of trade surpluses. Those dollars were supposed to be as good as gold. Now they were, what exactly? Paper backed by nothing but American promises that had just been broken? But the fury was most intense in Paris. De Gaulle had warned about this, had seen it coming, had tried to escape the system before it collapsed. Yet even he hadn't anticipated such a brazen, unilateral action. France's finance minister, Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, publicly declared the move a betrayal. Other European officials used harsher language in private: American imperialism, monetary dictatorship, the arrogance of an empire in decline. The Americans, they realized, had made a calculation. It's better to betray allies than to admit weakness. Better to force a new system than to negotiate one. Better to act decisively than to collapse slowly. And there was nothing anyone could do about it. Currencies in chaos. Monday, August 16th, 1971. Financial markets opened across Asia and Europe. Chaos. Foreign exchange traders stared at their screens, unsure how to price anything. If the dollar was no longer tied to gold, what was it tied to? If the dollar could float, shouldn't every other currency float too? What were the rules? What was the system? No one knew. Central banks across Europe closed their foreign exchange markets. They simply refused to trade dollars, unable to determine what value those dollars now held. The Japanese yen, the German mark, the Swiss franc, all experienced wild swings as traders tried to determine their worth in a world without anchors. Emergency meetings convened in Basel, where the Bank for International Settlements, the central bank for central banks, tried to coordinate a response. Finance ministers from the group of 10 industrial nations scheduled urgent negotiations, but the coordination was panicked, reactive, too late. The system had already broken. Now they were scrambling to build something new from the wreckage. The harsh realization. In the weeks following Nixon's announcement, as the initial shock began to fade, a sobering truth settled over global finance ministries. The United States hadn't asked permission because it didn't need permission. America held the cards, the largest economy, the strongest military, the currency everyone needed for trade. Other nations could complain, could protest, could express outrage, but they couldn't actually do anything. They couldn't force the US to reopen the gold window. They couldn't create an alternative system overnight. They couldn't abandon the dollar without destroying their own economies, which were deeply integrated with American markets. The harsh arithmetic of power meant that the United States could simply impose a new reality on the world, and everyone else had to adapt or suffer. This was the moment when many foreign officials realized that Bretton Woods had never been an agreement between equals. It had been an American system, tolerated by others as long as it served their interests, but ultimately governed by American needs and American decisions. Now those needs had changed, and the system changed with them. The emotional shift. The months after August 15th witnessed a profound psychological transformation in how the world understood money. The gold standard had provided certainty, something tangible to believe in. You might not understand complex economics, but you understood gold. You could see it, touch it, weigh it. It was real. Now money was trust, agreement, shared faith in governments and institutions. The dollar had value because everyone agreed it had value, and for no other reason. This was profoundly unsettling. It meant that money, The foundation of civilization, the mechanism that allowed complex societies to function, was ultimately based on collective belief. If that belief faltered, if that trust broke, the entire structure could collapse overnight. Some found this liberating. Money, they argued, should serve human needs, not be constrained by arbitrary metal supplies. Others found it terrifying. Without gold as an anchor, what would stop governments from printing unlimited amounts of currency? What would prevent inflation from destroying savings? What would discipline the powerful? Both groups were correct. The system Nixon created would prove to be both more flexible and more dangerous than the one it replaced, and the world was about to learn exactly what that meant. Act 5. The New Money, Fiat Currency. Defining fiat money. Fiat, a Latin word meaning "let it be done," a decree, a command. Fiat currency is money that exists because a government declares it exists. It has value because the state says it has value, enforces that value through law, and accepts it for taxes. That's it. No gold backing, no silver certificates, no promise to redeem the paper for anything physical. Just a government's word, backed by its power to tax, to regulate, to imprison those who refuse to accept its currency. This wasn't entirely new. Governments had experimented with fiat money before: ancient China, revolutionary France, the American colonies. But those experiments usually ended in hyperinflation and collapse. What made 1971 different was the scale. The United States wasn't some desperate government resorting to monetary manipulation out of necessity. It was the world's dominant superpower, making a calculated choice to abandon the gold standard permanently. And because the dollar was the global reserve currency, used for international trade and held in central bank reserves worldwide, America's choice became everyone's reality. The world didn't transition to fiat money. The world woke up one morning and discovered that it already had. The dollar's metamorphosis. After August 15, 1971, the dollar transformed from a claim on gold into a claim on what exactly? The answer, as it evolved through the 1970s, was faith in the United States government, the American economy, and the Federal Reserve's ability to manage monetary policy. This was a profound shift in the nature of value itself. Under the gold standard, a dollar represented a fixed quantity of metal. Now a dollar represented whatever the Federal Reserve said it represented, adjusted continuously through interest rates, money supply, and the complex mechanisms of modern central banking. In practical terms, this meant the Fed gained godlike powers over the economy. Want to stimulate growth? Lower interest rates, expand credit. Want to fight inflation? Raise rates, contract the money supply. The economy became something to be managed, tuned, optimized like a machine. The problem, of course, was that economies aren't machines. They're complex systems with millions of actors making billions of decisions. And the tools the Fed gained in 1971 were far more powerful and far more dangerous than most people realized. Banking system reinvented. The shift to fiat currency supercharged the banking system in ways that would have been impossible under gold. Under the old system, banks were constrained by their gold reserves. They could lend out perhaps 10 times their physical gold holdings through fractional reserve banking, but that was the limit. Now, the only constraint was the Federal Reserve's reserve requirements, which could be adjusted at will and eventually reduced to nearly zero. Credit exploded. Banks discovered they could create money through lending in quantities that would have been impossible before. Every loan created new money, money that didn't exist until someone signed the papers. This wasn't counterfeiting. This was the system working as designed, and it meant that the money supply was no longer really controlled by the Fed or any government. It was controlled by the collective lending decisions of thousands of banks, responding to market conditions, profit incentives, and their own optimistic or pessimistic views of the future. Money became elastic, expandable, capable of growing far faster than the economy itself. The hidden consequence. The architects of the new system promised that freeing money from gold would allow for more stable, managed growth. The Federal Reserve could respond to crises, smooth out business cycles, maintain employment. Instead, the 1970s delivered something unexpected: sustained, structural inflation that poisoned the economy for a decade. Oil shocks in 1973 and 1979 sent energy prices soaring. But those were triggers, not causes. The underlying cause was a money supply that had been unchained from any physical constraint, growing faster than the economy's ability to produce goods and services. Inflation reached double digits. Savings lost value. Workers saw their wages buy less each year, despite raises. The economy suffered from both high inflation and high unemployment, stagflation, the impossible condition that Keynesian economics said couldn't exist. The 1970s became a laboratory for discovering what happens when money loses its anchor. And the lessons were painful. Without discipline, without limits, fiat currency could be just as destructive as the gold standard had been restrictive. It would take a brutal recession in the early 1980s, engineered by Fed Chairman Paul Volcker through sky-high interest rates, to finally break the back of inflation and restore some faith in the dollar. But by then, the damage was done. The world had learned that fiat money was powerful but treacherous, capable of creating prosperity or destruction, depending on who controlled it and how wisely they wielded that control. Act 6. The explosion of debt. Governments learn they can borrow forever. Something remarkable happened after 1971, something that would have been impossible under the gold standard. Governments discovered they could borrow almost without limit. Under the old system, government debt was constrained by gold reserves and the threat that lenders might demand repayment in metal. Borrow too much, and you risked a confidence crisis, a run on your gold, national bankruptcy. But in the fiat currency world, governments that controlled their own currency gained a superpower. They could never technically default on debt denominated in that currency because they could always print more money to pay it back. This didn't mean borrowing was free. Printing money to pay debts caused inflation, which was its own form of default, paying creditors back with devalued currency. But it did mean that the old constraints had vanished, and so governments borrowed. They borrowed to fund social programs. They borrowed to fight wars. They borrowed to stimulate economies during recessions. They borrowed to pay interest on previous borrowing. The United States led the way. Federal debt, which had been declining as a percentage of GDP since World War II, began rising inexorably after 1971. From 35% of GDP to over 100% by the 2020s. Other nations followed the same trajectory. Japan, with government debt exceeding 200% of GDP. European nations with perpetual deficits. Everywhere the pattern repeated. Spend now, borrow to cover the difference. Promise to deal with the debt later. Later never came. Corporations leverage like never before. If governments discovered the power of unlimited borrowing, corporations became addicts. The post-1971 era saw an explosion in corporate debt that would have been unthinkable in previous generations. Companies borrowed to expand, to acquire competitors, to buy back their own stock, to pay dividends, to speculate in financial markets. Wall Street invented new instruments to facilitate this borrowing: junk bonds, leverage buyouts, complex derivatives. Finance itself became an industry, larger and more profitable than manufacturing. The logic was seductive. If you can borrow at 5% and invest for returns of 10%, you'd be foolish not to borrow as much as possible. Leverage amplified gains. Of course, it also amplified losses. The 1980s saw waves of corporate bankruptcies as over-leveraged companies collapsed. The 2008 financial crisis was fundamentally a debt crisis. Banks and corporations and homeowners all drowning in obligations they couldn't meet. But the system never learned. After each crisis, after each collapse, the response was the same. Bail out the failed institutions, cut interest rates to encourage more borrowing, and restart the cycle. Consumers enter the age of credit cards and mortgages. For individuals, the post-1971 world brought a revolution in personal finance, the democratization of debt. Credit cards, rare before the 1970s, became ubiquitous. Banks mailed pre-approved card offers to millions of households, offering the ability to borrow thousands of dollars with a signature. Mortgages evolved from conservative 30% down payment requirements to exotic instruments that let buyers purchase homes with nothing down. Home equity loans turned houses into ATMs, letting homeowners borrow against rising property values. Student loans ballooned as college costs soared, and governments made borrowing easy. Auto loans stretched from 3 years to 5 to 7, allowing people to buy more expensive vehicles than they could afford. The result was a fundamental shift in how people related to money. Previous generations had saved first, spent later. The new paradigm was spend now, pay later, maybe if you could. Consumer debt exploded, credit card balances, auto loans, student loans, mortgages, all soaring far faster than incomes. And why not? The government borrowed, corporations borrowed. Why shouldn't individuals do the same? The downward spiral. But here's what nobody wanted to acknowledge. The entire system had become a perpetual motion machine, powered by ever-increasing debt. Banks made money by lending, so they lent more to riskier borrowers at lower rates. Borrowers used that money to buy assets, stocks, real estate, commodities. Those purchases drove up asset prices. Higher asset prices made borrowers wealthier on paper, which allowed them to borrow even more. More borrowing meant more money-chasing assets, which drove prices higher still. It was a feedback loop with no natural stopping point. Or rather, with only one stopping point, the moment when borrowers couldn't borrow anymore, or lenders couldn't lend, or everyone simultaneously realized that the assets securing all that debt weren't actually worth what everyone pretended they were worth. That moment arrived in 2008, and then again in various forms throughout the 2010s and 2020s. Each time the response was the same. Central banks flooded the system with more money, drove interest rates lower, encouraged more borrowing, because the alternative, allowing the debt bubble to deflate naturally, would mean depression, mass bankruptcy, the collapse of the financial system itself. The machine, once started, couldn't be stopped. It could only grow, fed by ever-increasing amounts of debt, until the day it finally consumed itself.